Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of our Sunday morning Bible study, quarantine style. My name is Donny Phillips, and I am getting to lead this morning on Romans chapter 11. All right, so before we get into the chapter, just a quick note that the challenge here is to make these short and hopefully bring some truth in as well as some encouragement to you. But the interesting thing about chapter 11 is that it's not about us. It's not about you and me as the individual believer, as most of Romans is. Chapter 11 is strictly all about the Jewish people, the Israelite nation. And so we are going to pull some nuggets from this that we can relate to, and hopefully that will find some encouragement for you. But it is about the Jewish people. And we go back into chapter 10 because he's starting to set this up. Paul's starting to set this up in the end of chapter 10. And I'm only going to read the last verse, even though there's more to it in chapter 10. But I'm just reading the last verse as a precursor to what is coming within chapter 11. So let's look at Romans chapter 10, verse 21. It says, "But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people." So you can kind of see there, just in that little segment, that little bitty part, that God is already saying that they have walked away. They have been stubborn, and that's where Paul leads into chapter 11. Before we get into to reading chapter 11, think about this though. You look in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is completely about the Jewish nation and how God has raised them up as his chosen people. It starts with Abraham, and then you look in Hebrews 11, you look at the chapter of faith, and you see all of these faithful religious leaders that were building the faith all through the Old Testament. But you also see within that how the Jewish people decided to walk away from God at certain times. God would punish them through that, whether it be through exile, putting them into slavery, or whatever it may be. He punished them. They would come back to him, and of course he would accept them back, and then it would start all over again. It was just a revolving door there of them walking away from God and then coming back to him. And it's kind of what we see now with where we're at the beginning of chapter 11 and even now in present day. Chapter 11, verse 1 through 6. And this is Paul speaking. He says, "I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me." And what was God's answer to him? "I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace." Okay, so let's look at this a little bit deeper. First thing we see is him asking, so has God given up on Israel? And Paul says, no, look at me. I'm a Jew myself. I'm a descendant of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. And then he goes into some more history from the Old Testament where he talks about Elijah, where Elijah said, I'm the only one left. I'm the only one following God. And God said, no, I've got 7,000 others that haven't bowed to Baal yet. And so there's this remnant. And Paul's saying even now, after Jesus had ascended, and this is just not too long after that, just a few years later, he's saying even now there are those that are following him. There are those that are choosing to see Jesus as the Messiah, even though as a whole the Jewish race is not. And then he gets to that idea, that last verse that we read is the idea of grace. And the hard part about grace, especially for the Jewish people, is that if there's grace for them, then there's grace for all. If they get the grace, then so do we. And we get to have a relationship with Christ as well, if we accept that gift that God has given us. But as a prideful people, the Jews are saying, we've gone through all these hoops, we've jumped through all these hoops, we've done all these different things, we have all these religious rules and commands and laws that we follow, and they haven't had to do any of that. And so this can't be the right direction. This can't be the right way, because the Messiah that's coming is going to be for us and to bring us on top. And no longer will we be in captivity or under anyone else's rule, but we will be in charge, because the Messiah is going to put us there. And so they're seeing this grace as something that's accepting for everybody, and that just can't be right. And so there's this pride factor that comes in to what's going on with them at that moment. So then we get into the verses 8 through 10, and I'm not going to read them, but it's talking about how God has hardened their hearts. But I want to clarify something, I guess, before we move forward, is that when it says that their hearts are hardened and God did that, it's more about related to the story of the prodigal son. The father allowed the son to have his inheritance, to walk away. He knew what the son was going to do, maybe not specifically, but he knew that he was going to go squander his wealth. He was going to make lots of mistakes, and it hurt him. It saddened him greatly, but he allowed him to go do that. But it also says that the father was waiting for him, that as soon as the son was coming back, he's running for him, running to him, and so excited to see him back. And it's kind of what this means as far as hardening their hearts. He's basically allowed the Jewish people what they want. He's allowing them to walk away and to reject Christ, but he's waiting for them. And he knows that there's a time when they will come back, and that's part of his plan. So I think there's a few takeaways that we can get from Romans 11. A couple of things that hopefully will bring you some encouragement. One is that just as the Jewish people are not too far gone for God to reclaim them, neither are you. And we see that with how he's treating the Jewish people, how he is going to reclaim them in spite of the fact that they've rejected Christ as the Messiah for 2,000 years now. The other thing that we can pull from this is, just as his grace covers us, he covers everyone. So there's those people in our lives that we may think are too far gone, that they don't want to listen. They have no desire to hear about God. God's grace covers them as well. His mercy is big enough for them as well. And Paul ends the chapter with a prayer. 33 through 36 is a prayer. And I want to end this time just reading that as a prayer for us as well. Yes, God's riches are very great, and his wisdom and knowledge have no end. No one can explain the things God decides or understands his ways. As the scripture says, who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been able to give him advice? No one has ever given God anything that he must pay back. Yes, God made all things, and everything continues through him and for him. To him be the glory forever. Amen.